America has an abundance of thriving cities spread across the country. However, as these cities thrive and the industries within them boom, it encourages the gentrification of their neighborhoods. It is important to understand what gentrification is in order to avoid any misconceptions about it. Gentrification is when a higher income individual invests in a low income neighborhood. For example, in a low income neighborhood, a high income person might purchase an apartment building with low income residents in an affordable restaurant at the bottom. This developer would evict the low income tenants and then renovate the apartments in the commercial use space underneath. Following the renovation, the apartments are more desirable and therefore command a more premium price. The commercial use space beneath the apartments is now also more desirable, as there are now middle to upper middle income people living in the apartment building. This renovation could lead to a nicer, trendier restaurant or store opening up in the building that commands a higher price. This store is now no longer affordable for low-income tenants living in the neighboring buildings. Once this apartment complex is renovated, it makes the neighborhood more desirable and encourages redevelopment of even more housing and retail space. But what about the people that used to live in these low-income buildings? Once a neighborhood becomes more and more gentrified, there will be significantly less low-income housing available in that neighborhood. This means that the low-income residents who used to live there will become displaced from this neighborhood, often having to move farther away from their job or the city center. However, when diving deeper into the problem of gentrification, the inequality of it becomes obvious. In these low-income neighborhoods, which are becoming increasingly subjected to gentrification, the residents being impacted are disproportionately African American and Latino. The people moving into these newly gentrified neighborhoods consist mostly of middle to high income whites. As the economic and racial makeup of these neighborhoods shifts, African Americans and Latinos are the ones who are suffering from the higher rent prices. Let's zoom in on San Francisco, where extensive gentrification of poor, predominantly immigrant neighborhoods has made it the city with the most expensive housing in America. After the dot-com boom in the 1990s, San Francisco gained a large demand for skilled tech workers. These workers, who were often wealthier, moved into parts of the city like the Mission District, which was historically a working-class neighborhood with a significant Latino population. As more affluent white tech workers moved into the Mission District, the rent prices increased. This caused many Latino families to move out of the neighborhood. Between 1980 and 2013, the Latino population of the Mission District decreased from 44% to 38%, while the white population rose from 36% to 43%. These trends are happening in historically diverse neighborhoods across the country. Gentrification perpetuates America's inequality problem. The gentrification of these neighborhoods only makes it harder for the low-income residents to climb the socioeconomic ladder, as they're often left with longer commute times or a worse job, as they have had to move out of the gentrified neighborhoods. It is also important to look at the two types of displacement that can cause people to be forced out of their neighborhoods. The first form of displacement that takes place is when rent prices are increased. For example, a resident pays $450 a month in rent, and their rent increases to $650 a month. This resident can no longer afford their rent and is forced to find a different place to live. Because the rest of the neighborhood is becoming gentrified, housing prices continue to increase, forcing them to look towards other neighborhoods. The second way people become displaced is when the neighborhood has changed so much that the community and the culture that original residents were used to no longer exists within that neighborhood. This form of displacement essentially means that gentrification has caused the character of the neighborhood to change. Even if they can still afford the rent, the restaurants and the shops are too expensive, and the neighborhood they could once afford has changed to where most things are unaffordable. This causes people to leave the neighborhood because the community is different, and it's hard to live in a neighborhood where you cannot afford to eat at its restaurants or shop at its shops. While gentrification does increase property value in communities and neighborhoods that have historically not seen significant amounts of investment, the people who live there are not the ones who are going to enjoy the benefits of the investment to their neighborhood, but instead end up getting displaced. Now, let's look at gentrification and revitalization happening around Cincinnati. Gentrification is happening on the largest scale in the neighborhood of Over the Rhine. These construction projects are fueled by 3CDC, a nonprofit development organization founded with the help of the city of Cincinnati, who aim to improve life in the city center through revitalization. The nonprofit spends tens of millions of dollars a year purchasing old rundown buildings around Over the Rhine and renovating them, creating higher-end market rate real estate. You can look at this in two ways. The first way being that Over the Rhine was once one of the most high crime and rundown neighborhoods in America, and through the work of 3CDC and other development organizations, it turned into a safer and trendier neighborhood. The second way of looking at this is that the lower income people who used to live in these neighborhoods have to suffer higher rent and displacement because of this development. The development of these neighborhoods leads to a higher cost of living that the original inhabitants cannot afford. This forces them to find new homes, often farther away from their jobs, which is essentially no fault of their own. 3CDC alone has completed or is completing over 75 projects around Cincinnati and Over the Rhine, and it only continues to grow. Over the Rhine used to almost completely consist of affordable housing. However, 3CDC's projects usually create market rate apartments and condos, with less than half being affordable housing units. There just isn't enough affordable housing for everyone who used to live in this neighborhood. However, it's important to understand both sides of gentrification. Many of the buildings renovated by 3CDC were abandoned, with no one living in them. What use would these buildings serve to the community anyway? By revitalizing these buildings, one can argue that 3CDC has actually created more housing and more affordable housing than there was before. This compelling argument can also be taken to the Cincinnati neighborhood of Madisonville, where a similar thing is happening. To farther understand community development, I spoke with developer Dobbs Ackerman of the Ackerman Group, which is working on construction projects in Cincinnati's Madisonville neighborhood. Would you say that the government encourages redevelopment of certain neighborhoods?
Absolutely they do. But it's a very tricky thing because they can only do so much of it. There's so much animosity or frustration or tension and combativeness that occurs in the process. I'm sure the city would love to do a lot of redevelopment, but it's so hard to do and so combative to do. And so they pick, certain areas in the city that they're going to work on. Over the Rhine was one of them. Madisonville was one of them. Price Hill is another one of them over on the west side. Walnut Hills is another one. But they pick certain areas that they're willing to go into these combative situations, and they work on them for years. Like, they may work for 10 years in some of these areas to try to create enough change from the city perspective to where then the marketplace, without the city's help, comes in to really continue the momentum within that community.
As a developer, do you have to look for certain places or certain parts of a neighborhood when looking to revitalize it?
You do, but you have to do it in conjunction with the city to know that you have their support. And then you have to do that also with the community to understand if they want to go through that change.
And does the city of Cincinnati and other governments do anything to, promote this or promote low-income housing to be built? Or do they kind of leave it to developers to take on the cost?
No, they do promote it, but they only have so much money to be able to do it. I mean, I don't know what the numbers are, but I bet if the city was able to support in the projects that are going on for 1 year, I bet if they're able to support, $20 to $40 million, they're doing really, really well.
So in neighborhoods in Cincinnati like Madisonville and over the Rhine, do you think there's a certain balance that needs to be met between market rate housing and affordable housing?
Yeah, I do. And right now, in the work that we're doing in Madisonville, we set the target at 20%. And so 20% of the units are for what we call, or the federal government calls, a moderate income position. And so I think you have to work at this from all different angles. The city has to figure out how to bring more money to the table. Communities have to figure out how to support projects in the right way instead of be combative against them. Developers have to accept that you need to work housing for below market rate into projects to help support the need that's out there. And we just have to be able to chip away at it.
So what sort of things does the Ackerman Group have to do to essentially get these projects approved and go forward with it, even when there's still going to be community members that are opposing the development?
We have to be able to prove the project's value in total to the community. Mm-hmm. And so what I mean by that is, as part of community progress, we have to show that by having more people live in the community, that's going to have a positive impact. We have to show that by also having a project that blends subsidizing some of the housing, that we are helping the environment related to the housing need. And we have to be acceptance of, or we have to have acceptance for, appreciating the history of the community that we come into, while at the same time making sure that we are creating something that is going to be appropriate for the next, 50 to 100 years.
Gentrification in neighborhood development is an issue with two perspectives, and it's important to fully understand both perspectives. To someone driving through a redeveloped neighborhood, natural instinct can view the new buildings, sidewalks, and stores as an improvement and something that's good for the neighborhood and its community. However, an equally strong case can be made that contrasts this perspective. As development changes and shapes the communities in which it takes place, one can argue that the local community is paying the price for the redevelopment. To farther understand the impact that development has on neighborhoods and their residents, I spoke with Evan Holt, who's running for Cincinnati City Council and has made affordable housing a key pillar of his campaign. Can a neighborhood be rehabilitated without being gentrified?
I personally believe they absolutely can be. It's just about where you're delegating the resources and targeting things. So what you have now is a lot of the development's been happening is surrounding putting up condos. You see those kind of 5/1 buildings kind of popping up everywhere. And they put them in, and because the developer is seeking to get the highest turnaround profit, he's going to charge the highest amount he can feel like he can charge in rent. So even though the surrounding area might be rent that's like maybe 600, 700, 800, reasonably affordably priced, putting in one of those units then drives up the overall price of the surrounding area. So now the landlords in the surrounding area are like, oh, well, they're charging this much, I can charge $100 more, even though they haven't done any improvements to the existing unit. So it's about being more thoughtful in what we're putting units, what we're charging for them, so that we're not pricing people out of areas, just because of development that's happening. Development should be able to coexist with the existing surrounding neighborhoods, at least in theory. The problem is moneyed interests kind of come in with a sledgehammer as opposed to a scalpel in terms of their vision for development.
Do you feel that a good solution to this problem where a neighborhood can be rehabilitated, but also without pushing out the residents, is to make more of a 50-50 split between them, or does something else need to be done?
I mean, I think a 50-50 split would be a good concession, but for certain areas, I feel like there's really no necessity to have higher end housing unless there appears to be a demand for it. A lot of times these developers are putting in the housing and they're waiting for the demand to come. But that being said, so what they're doing is they're always offering these tax incentives to get people to invest. But the thing is, these people want to invest. You're not trying to incentivize them to invest in a neighborhood that's not being developed, like say the West Side, which could absolutely use a lot more development. It's being targeted in OTR.
Do you feel like the city should do something to more evenly spread out where this development is taking place instead of just targeting neighborhoods like over the Rhine and Clifton and Madisonville?
Absolutely, and that's what we're kind of pushing for. It's like, it seems to be that in the last 10 years or so, council's focus has been in OTR in order to drive up, get more tax base, and by having a lot more people, tourist dollars, people spending money in OTR and spending things, whatever. That's cool, it's great, but it's been the neglect at the rest of the entire city. So yeah, those TIF dollars should definitely be divvied up to developed, underdeveloped neighborhoods. And when we talk about affordable housing, it also should not be consolidated to just the handful of neighborhoods that's zoned for that. So for example, a neighborhood like Oakley or Hyde Park or other ones who are kind of higher end neighborhoods are zoned specifically that they cannot have multi-unit structures in them. So those zoning laws have to be addressed before we can even have more reasonable housing options and not just a handful of neighborhoods.
What can governments, and specifically the city of Cincinnati, do to kind of prevent wide-scale gentrification from happening in their cities?
Well, I mean, council and city manager's office, they make a lot of decisions in terms of every development deal that happens. So just being more thoughtful about those decisions when they're happening. So yeah, city government, local government specifically, city council, the mayor, and the manager's office specifically have a lot of influence on what happens. They everything goes through them. Or oftentimes with 3CDC, they'll say they're preserving historical buildings, but really they're sitting on them until they're so dilapidated they have to be torn down, and now they get access to that land. But they have assets to the tune of $400 million, including properties they're sitting on. And the excuse is well, they're already providing affordable housing. It's not nearly enough relative to who they've displaced since their existence.
Do you feel like a neighborhood could be improved without sort of this gentrifying development from occurring?
Sure, absolutely. There's tons of ways to do that. The problem is that development gets conflated with gentrification. Development doesn't inherently mean gentrification. Development can mean putting in a new park. Development can mean specifically adding more street light. So you can very much improve a neighborhood by taking better care of it, as opposed to forcing out the people to build a better thing and then start taking care of it. You can take care of it right now. You can pave these streets. You can take care of the litter. You can make sure this place has access to a grocery store. You can do tons of things to improve a neighborhood without displacing the residents. It's that we get it in our head that the two can't coexist, as if low-income people are not deserving of a better place to live.
Gentrification is a battle of perspectives, and it's easy to find oneself behind either perspective. It is an issue with much more to it than meets the eye. It's an issue where it's hard to fully understand the impacts unless directly or indirectly impacted by it.